The spotlights dimmed across the grand ballroom of the Meridian Conference Center as Prince Alexander stepped toward the podium. 500 of the world's most influential charity leaders sat in hushed anticipation, their phones already recording what they expected to be another routine royal speech about mental health awareness. But tonight would shatter every expectation they held about the royal family. Tonight, the carefully orchestrated world of palace protocol would crack wide open, revealing secrets that had been buried for months. As Alexander's voice began to waver through his opening remarks, a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the hall. The gasps that followed would echo through headlines for weeks to come. That the story behind that moment had been brewing in the corridors of Buckingham Palace for far longer than anyone realized. Prince Alexander Henry Windsor stood before the mirror in his private chambers at Kensington Palace, adjusting his navy blue suit for the third time in 10 minutes. The October evening was crisp, and through his window, he could see the last golden leaves clinging desperately to the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas. Tonight felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. The familiar weight of duty pressed against his shoulders, as it had every day since his mother's death 5 years ago. But there was something else now. A restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing week. His reflection stared back at him with eyes that held the same deep blue as his late mother's, though they carried shadows she had never worn. At 34, Alexander had learned to wear many masks. Tonight's mask was that of the dutiful prince, the passionate advocate for mental health awareness, the man who had transformed his own struggles into a force for good. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior, another story was unfolding. The knock at his door came precisely at 7 o'clock. "Your Royal Highness, the car is ready," announced his private secretary, James Morrison, a man whose loyalty had been tested and proven through years of service. James had been with Alexander since his early 20s, watching him navigate the treacherous waters of royal life, while trying to maintain some semblance of authenticity. "Thank you, James. I'll be right down." Alexander's voice carried the practiced calm that years of public speaking had taught him, but James detected something underneath, a tension that hadn't been there during their briefing that morning. As they descended the grand staircase, Alexander's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with his father, King Charles, just 3 days earlier. The meeting in the king's study had been tense, filled with unspoken accusations and carefully measured words that barely concealed years of frustration. "The family's reputation must come first, Alexander," the king had said, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the palace gardens. "Your personal feelings, whatever they may be, cannot supersede the monarchy's stability. And what about honesty, father? What about truth?" Alexander had replied, his voice tight with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. "Truth is a luxury we cannot always afford," came the reply that had haunted Alexander ever since. Now, settling into the back seat of the black Range Rover, Alexander reviewed his speech notes one final time. The Meridian Conference Center was hosting the annual Global Mental Health Summit, an event Alexander had helped establish 4 years ago following his own very public struggle with anxiety and depression after his military service. Tonight's speech was meant to focus on breakthrough research in trauma therapy, but Alexander found himself thinking about a different kind of breakthrough entirely. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of it. Tonight's the night, Chi-Si, Charlotte." Even seeing that single initial made his chest tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, the Duchess of Westshire, had been absent from public life for exactly 3 months, 17 days, and roughly 6 hours. Not that Alexander was counting. Their last conversation had ended with words neither could take back, accusations that had torn through the careful fabric of their public marriage like a knife through silk. The official story, carefully crafted by the palace's communications team, was that Charlotte was taking a much-needed break to focus on her mental health, a narrative that wasn't entirely false, just incomplete. The truth was far more complicated, involving late-night arguments that echoed through palace corridors, thrown accusations about duty versus authenticity, and a marriage that had become a performance neither of them could sustain. As the Range Rover wound through London's evening traffic, Alexander remembered the early days of their relationship. They had met at a charity gala for Veterans Affairs, where Charlotte's work with military families had caught his attention long before her beauty did. She was different from the other women in his circle, unafraid to speak her mind, passionate about causes that mattered, and seemingly immune to the typical royal charm that had opened so many doors. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of stolen moments between official engagements, secret dates in countryside pubs, and long conversations about changing the world. The media had called them the perfect couple. The war veteran prince finding love with the compassionate duchess who had dedicated her life to helping others heal from trauma. But perfection, Alexander had learned, was often just another word for fiction. The wedding had been a spectacle watched by millions around the world. Charlotte had looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace, her smile genuine as she pledged to love and honor him through better or worse. They had believed their love could withstand anything the royal machinery could throw at them. They had been naive. The first cracks had appeared within months of the wedding. The relentless scrutiny of the media, the rigid protocol of palace life, and the constant pressure to present a flawless image had begun to wear on Charlotte in ways neither of them had anticipated. She was a woman accustomed to action, to making real change in people's lives. But royal life often felt like an elaborate pantomime, where good intentions were buried beneath layers of tradition and bureaucracy. Alexander had watched helplessly as the vibrant, passionate woman he'd fallen in love with began to dim under the weight of expectations. She started having panic attacks before public appearances, crying herself to sleep after particularly harsh media coverage, and questioning whether her presence in the royal family was helping or hindering the causes she cared about. The breaking point had come during the summer charity tour through Africa. What should have been a triumphant showcase of their joint humanitarian work had become a disaster of epic proportions. A series of leaked private conversations had painted Charlotte as ungrateful and Alexander as weak, unable to control his own wife. The palace's response had been swift and merciless. More restrictions, more handlers, more scripts to follow. "I can't breathe in this life," Charlotte had told him during their final argument, her eyes red with tears and exhaustion. "I'm suffocating, and you're so wrapped up in protecting the institution that you can't see I'm drowning." "I'm trying to protect you," Alexander had replied, his own voice breaking. "This is how we survive here. This is how we make it work." "This isn't working," she had whispered. "This isn't living. This is just existing, and I won't do it anymore." She had left that night for her family's estate in Scotland, ostensibly for a temporary retreat that had stretched into months of silence. The palace had maintained the fiction of her voluntary absence while privately, Alexander knew the truth. Charlotte was considering whether their marriage could survive the impossible demands of royal life. Now, as the Range Rover pulled up to the Meridian Conference Center, Alexander could see the familiar circus of photographers and reporters gathering behind the security barriers. Their camera flashes created a strobe light effect against the building's glass facade, and he could hear the shouted questions even through the vehicle's bulletproof windows. "Prince Alexander! Any word on when the Duchess will return to public duties? Your Highness, is it true the marriage is in trouble? Prince Alexander, how are you coping without your wife's support?" James reached over and squeezed Alexander's shoulder. "Just remember, sir, focus on the message tonight. The work matters more than the noise." Alexander nodded, straightening his shoulders and sliding into the familiar role of public figure. But as he stepped out of the car and into the flash of cameras, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. The text message from Charlotte burned in his memory, and for the first time in months, he felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The conference center's lobby was filled with the gentle hum of conversation from mental health professionals, researchers, and advocates from around the world. Alexander moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, asking thoughtful questions about ongoing projects, and expressing genuine interest in the groundbreaking work being presented. This was the part of royal life he truly loved. The connections with people doing meaningful work, the opportunity to amplify important causes, the chance to use his platform for genuine good. Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant researcher from Cambridge who had become a personal friend over the years, approached with her usual warm smile. "Alexander, wonderful to see you tonight. Your speech is going to be particularly meaningful given everything that's been happening in the field." "Thank you, Sarah. I've been reading about your latest study on EMDR therapy for military veterans. Fascinating work." Alexander's interest was genuine. He had participated in similar therapy himself during his darkest period following his combat deployment. "Actually, Dr. Chen continued, lowering her voice slightly, "I wanted to mention something. Charlotte contacted me last week about potentially collaborating on a new initiative. She seemed very excited about some ideas she's been developing during her time away." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. This was the first he'd heard of Charlotte reaching out to anyone in their professional circle. Did she say anything specific about her plans? Not in detail, but she mentioned wanting to approach mental health advocacy differently. Something about breaking down barriers and reaching people who feel excluded from traditional support systems. It sounded very much like Charlotte. Doctor. Chen smiled warmly. She also asked about you, how you were doing, whether you seemed happy. Before Alexander could respond, James appeared at his elbow. Your Highness, it's time for the final preparations. The event begins in 20 minutes. As they made their way toward the backstage area, Alexander's mind raced with questions. What had Charlotte been planning during her months of absence? Why had she reached out to Dr. Marvel? Chen but maintained radio silence with him? And what did her cryptic text message mean about tonight being the night? The backstage area buzzed with the efficient energy of a well-coordinated event. Sound technicians made final adjustments to microphones, lighting crews tested spotlights, and event organizers reviewed the evening's timeline with military precision. Alexander had given hundreds of speeches over the years, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that went beyond the usual pre-event nerves. Margaret Thornbury, the summit's chief organizer, approached with her tablet and headset, looking every inch the competent professional who had built this conference into one of the world's premier mental health events.
Your Highness, we're absolutely delighted to have you here tonight.
The audience is particularly excited. We have representatives from 43 countries, including several new research institutions from underserved communities. That's wonderful, Margaret. The global perspective is what makes this summit so valuable. Alexander reviewed his notes one final time, though he practically knew the speech by heart. I should mention, Margaret continued, we've had several last-minute additions to the guest list. Nothing that affects the program, but the interest level has been extraordinary today. Something in her tone made Alexander look up from his notes. Last-minute additions? Yes, quite a few requests from prominent figures in the field. Dr. Martinez from the World Health Organization, Ambassador Richardson from the UN Mental Health Initiative, several other unexpected but welcome attendees. Margaret checked her tablet again.
Actually, there was one rather unusual request that came through official channels this afternoon, but I'm not supposed to discuss it.
Before Alexander could ask what she meant, the stage manager appeared with his headset crackling. 5 minutes to curtain, Your Highness. Ready for your entrance cue? Alexander nodded, taking a deep breath and centering himself the way his therapist had taught him years ago. Focus on the message, he reminded himself. Focus on the people who needed to hear these words. Whatever else was happening tonight, the work itself remained pure and important. As he took his position in the wings, Alexander could hear the audience settling into their seats. 500 of the world's most dedicated mental health professionals, all united by their commitment to healing and hope. This was his element, his passion, the place where his royal platform could create real change. The lights dimmed, and Margaret's voice echoed through the sound system as she began the evening's opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th Annual Global Mental Health Summit. Tonight, we gather not just as professionals, but as human beings committed to understanding and healing the invisible wounds that affect millions worldwide. Standing in the darkness of the wings, Alexander felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever happened tonight, whatever surprises awaited, he knew this work mattered more than palace politics or media speculation. These people in the audience were changing lives, saving lives, offering hope to those who had lost it. But as Margaret's introduction continued, Alexander noticed something unusual. There was a subtle commotion near the back of the auditorium, security personnel speaking quietly into their radios, event staff moving with more urgency than the situation seemed to warrant. From his position backstage, he couldn't see what was happening, but he could sense the shift in energy. And now, please join me in welcoming His Royal Highness Prince Alexander, Duke of Cambridge, whose personal journey and professional dedication have made him one of the world's most authentic voices in mental health advocacy. The applause was warm and genuine as Alexander walked onto the stage, but his trained eye caught something else. Several audience members had their phones out, not for the usual social media documentation, but as if they were expecting something specific to happen. In the back corners of the room, he noticed additional security personnel who hadn't been there during his earlier arrival. Reaching the podium, Alexander smiled at the audience and began his prepared remarks. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you all for being here tonight. When we talk about mental health, we often speak in clinical terms: diagnosis, treatment, recovery. But behind every statistic is a human story, a person struggling to find their way back to hope. His voice was steady, confident, drawing on years of public speaking experience. But part of his mind remained alert to the subtle undercurrents in the room. Something was building, something he couldn't quite identify but could feel in the way certain audience members seemed more focused on the back of the room than on his words. Which brings me to tonight's central theme, Alexander continued, his speech building toward its key message about innovative approaches to trauma therapy. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we have the courage to be vulnerable, to show our authentic selves rather than the masks we think the world wants to see. As the words left his mouth, Alexander realized how prophetic they might be, because in that moment, he caught a glimpse of movement at the very back of the auditorium, a figure emerging from the shadows, moving with the graceful confidence he would recognize anywhere. His voice faltered for just a moment, so briefly that most of the audience might not have noticed, but his heart began to race as he realized that tonight's speech about authenticity and courage was about to become far more personal than anyone in the audience could have imagined. Charlotte was here. The moment Charlotte stepped into the pool of light at the back of the auditorium, the entire dynamic of the room shifted like a tide turning. She wore a deep emerald dress that Alexander remembered from their honeymoon in Italy, simple, elegant, and utterly her. Her auburn hair was shorter than when he'd last seen her, cut in a way that framed her face and made her green eyes appear even more striking under the conference center's lights. But it was her posture that truly caught his attention. There was a confidence there, a sense of purpose that had been missing during those final painful months before her departure. Alexander's practiced composure wavered as he watched her move through the audience with quiet determination. She wasn't seeking attention or creating drama. Instead, she seemed almost ethereal, like someone who had spent months in the wilderness and emerged transformed. The audience members nearest to her began to notice, heads turning, whispered recognitions spreading through the crowd like ripples on water. But Charlotte paid no attention to the growing awareness of her presence. Her eyes were fixed solely on Alexander, and in them he saw something that made his chest tighten with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. Love, yes, but also resolve, and perhaps most importantly, forgiveness. "I apologize," Alexander said into the microphone, his voice catching slightly. "I seem to have lost my place for a moment." The audience chuckled politely, assuming it was simply a minor stumble from a speaker known for his eloquence. Only Alexander knew that his entire world was being quietly revolutionized in real time. He found his place in the speech again, but now every word felt charged with new meaning. As he spoke about the importance of authentic connection in healing trauma, he was acutely aware that Charlotte had moved closer, now perhaps halfway up the center aisle. She moved slowly, respectfully, not wanting to disturb the event, but with clear intention. "One of the most profound barriers to mental health recovery," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke words that now felt deeply personal, "is the fear of being truly seen. We construct elaborate facades to protect ourselves from judgment, but in doing so, we also isolate ourselves from genuine connection." Charlotte had stopped walking and stood perfectly still about 10 rows from the stage. Even in the dimmed lighting, Alexander could see tears glistening in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but something deeper and more complex. Around her, audience members were beginning to realize what was happening, but rather than creating chaos, there was an almost reverent hush falling over the room.
Dr.
Sarah Chen, seated in the third row, had noticed Charlotte's presence and was watching the unfolding scene with the fascination of someone witnessing history in the making. This was far beyond any royal protocol she'd ever observed. This was raw, real, and completely unprecedented. "The courage to be vulnerable," Alexander said, his eyes now locked on Charlotte's, "often requires us to step out of the shadows we've been hiding in, to trust that love can survive truth and that authentic connection is worth any risk to our carefully constructed safety." It was then that Charlotte began walking again, moving with quiet grace toward the stage. The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary but not wanting to disturb the delicate magic of the moment. Camera phones emerged from pockets and purses, but even the most eager social media enthusiasts seemed to understand that this required reverence rather than sensationalism. Alexander's speech had become something entirely different from what he'd planned. The prepared remarks about therapeutic breakthroughs felt hollow compared to the very real breakthrough happening before everyone's eyes. Without conscious decision, he began to speak from his heart rather than from his notes. 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium, I stood before another audience and spoke about the importance of mental health support systems. I talked about the danger of isolation, about the healing power of community, about the courage required to reach out when we're struggling. Charlotte had reached the steps leading to the stage. She paused there, her hand resting on the railing, looking up at him with an expression that combined love, uncertainty, and desperate hope. What I didn't say, Alexander continued, setting aside his prepared text completely, was that I was speaking about theories I understood intellectually but had failed to practice in my own life. I had allowed fear and tradition and the weight of expectations to create distance from the person I love most in this world. The auditorium was completely silent now, save for the barely audible hum of the sound system. Even the photographers outside seemed to have sensed something significant was happening, their usual clamour replaced by an expectant quiet. "Your Royal Highness," came a whispered voice from the wings. James Morrison, looking simultaneously concerned and amazed at what was unfolding. But Alexander barely heard him. His entire focus was on Charlotte, who had taken the first step onto the stage. "Mental health recovery," Alexander said, his voice now thick with emotion, "requires us to be honest about our failures as well as our successes. It requires us to acknowledge when our coping mechanisms have become barriers to connection rather than bridges to healing." Charlotte was on the stage now, standing just outside the bright circle of spotlights that illuminated the podium. She was close enough that Alexander could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing, could recognize the particular way she pressed her lips together when she was fighting back tears. The audience was transfixed. This was unprecedented in modern royal history, a deeply personal moment playing out on a public stage, with no palace handlers or protocol officers controlling the narrative. It was raw, real, and utterly human in a way that royal appearances rarely allowed themselves to be. "I have spent the last 3 months," Alexander continued, his prepared speech completely abandoned now, "learning to understand the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Learning to see the difference between supporting a person and managing their image. Learning that love without freedom isn't love at all, it's possession disguised as devotion." Charlotte took another step forward, moving into the edge of the spotlight. The emerald dress seemed to shimmer in the stage lights, but it was her face that truly glowed, with tears, with hope, with the kind of radiant vulnerability that comes from someone who has fought their way through darkness and emerged determined to choose love over fear. "I stand before you tonight," Alexander said, his voice now addressing Charlotte as much as the audience, "not as a perfect advocate for mental health, but as someone still learning, still growing, still discovering that the bravest thing we can do is choose connection over control, trust over fear, and love over the safety of emotional distance." The moment stretched like crystal about to shatter, beautiful, fragile, and impossible to preserve. Alexander could feel 500 pairs of eyes watching them, could sense the historic nature of what was happening, but all of that faded into background noise compared to the simple reality of Charlotte's presence. She reached into her small evening purse and pulled out a piece of paper, folded, creased from being carried for who knows how long. Without speaking, she held it out toward Alexander, her hand trembling slightly. Alexander stepped away from the podium, the microphone no longer needed for this most intimate part of their public moment. He took the paper from her hand, their fingers touching briefly, electrically. Unfolding it, he recognized Charlotte's handwriting, neat, precise, but with the slight rightward slant that appeared when she was writing something deeply emotional. The note contained just a few lines. "I've spent 3 months learning to be brave enough for both of us. I've learned that loving you and loving myself don't have to be mutually exclusive. If you're ready to try something different, something real, then I'm ready too. Always and forever, C." Alexander looked up from the note to find Charlotte watching him with an expression of such open hope that it nearly broke his heart. This was the woman who had warped away from everything, from comfort, from security, from the golden cage of royal life, in order to find herself. And now she was standing here, in front of hundreds of strangers and countless cameras, offering him the chance to choose love over duty, authenticity over appearances. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, turning back to the microphone but reaching out to take Charlotte's hand. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Charlotte, the Duchess of Westshire, who has just demonstrated more courage in the last 5 minutes than I have shown in the last 5 months." The applause that erupted was unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping typical of royal events, but something warmer, more genuine. The sound of hundreds of people who had just witnessed something real and beautiful and utterly human. Charlotte stepped closer to the microphone, her voice soft but clear as she addressed the audience for the first time. "Thank you all for your incredible work in mental health advocacy. When Alexander asked me to marry him, I thought love meant supporting each other's dreams. What I learned was that sometimes love means having the courage to challenge each other to be better, even when it's painful." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of struggle, growth, and hard-won wisdom. Alexander could see audience members wiping their eyes, moved not just by the romantic drama of the moment, but by the deeper truth of what Charlotte was expressing about the work of real love. "I spent 3 months in therapy," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not because our marriage was broken, but because I was. I'd lost myself trying to be the person I thought everyone else needed me to be. Tonight, I'm here as myself. Flawed, learning, but no longer hiding." Alexander squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by her courage and by the profound gift of her return. But even as joy flooded through him, he knew this moment was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding their marriage, of creating a life together that honored both their love and their individual authenticity, would happen away from cameras and spotlights. Dr. Sarah Chen was openly crying now, along with many others in the audience. This wasn't just a royal reunion, it was a masterclass in vulnerability, in the kind of emotional courage that made real healing possible. "I have just one more thing to add to tonight's message about mental health," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "Recovery isn't a destination, it's a daily choice to keep choosing connection over isolation, growth over stagnation, and love over fear. Charlotte and I have a lot of work ahead of us, but we're committed to doing that work together, honestly, and with the same authenticity we're asking all of you to bring to your vital work in this field." The standing ovation that followed seemed to go on forever, but Alexander barely heard it. His entire focus was on Charlotte, on the way the stage lights caught the gold flecks in her green eyes, on the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, on the way her hand felt in his after months of absence. As the applause finally began to subside, Alexander realized that his prepared speech about breakthrough research and innovative treatments had been completely forgotten. Instead, he and Charlotte had just provided the audience with something far more valuable, a real-time demonstration of what breakthrough looked like, what innovation in human connection could accomplish, and what happened when two people chose to be brave enough for love. But even as they stood together in the glow of stage lights and audience appreciation, both Alexander and Charlotte knew that the real challenges lay ahead. Walking off this stage together would be easy compared to the work of rebuilding trust, renegotiating their relationship with royal duty, and creating a marriage that could survive the pressures that had nearly destroyed them before. The conference organizers were clearly unsure how to proceed. This had gone so far beyond their planned programming that there was no protocol to follow. Margaret Thornbury stood in the wings with her tablet and headset, looking simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the historic moment she had just facilitated. Alexander turned back to the microphone one final time. "Thank you all for your patience with this unexpected turn in tonight's program. I hope our story, messy and unfinished as it is, serves as a reminder that the work you do matters not just for your patients and clients, but for all of us who are still learning how to be human, how to love well, and how to choose courage over comfort." As they prepared to leave the stage together, Charlotte leaned close to Alexander's ear and whispered something that made him smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd worn in months. Whatever she had said was lost to the audience, but the intimacy of the moment, the clear joy and relief on both their faces, spoke volumes about the journey they had traveled to reach this point. Hand in hand, they walked toward the wings, leaving behind a room full of mental health professionals who had just witnessed something unprecedented, not just in royal history, but in the annals of public vulnerability and authentic human connection.